Thank you very much, Izzy, and thank you for the invitation and the hospitality here in Helsinki over the last 2 days. It's a real pleasure to be here and to contribute, I hope in some small way, to your discussions and debates. So what I'm going to talk about today is the national research evaluation process in the United Kingdom called the Research Excellence Framework, and focus particularly on assessment of broader societal impact within that. I think in many ways that the processes that I'm talking about are very different from your strategic research program. This is a national level assessment that looks at all research, however it's been funded, that's carried out in universities. But I hope I can tease out in the next few minutes some lessons and some food for thought as you think about the challenges around impact assessment that have just been articulated for this program. So I really wanted to cover three areas in the course of this presentation. I want to start just by giving you a little bit of context around the UK system, which I think will help understand why we do things in the way that we do, and then move on to talk in a bit more detail about the Research Excellence Framework and the assessment of broader impact within that. I will mostly talk about the Research Excellence Framework that took place, concluded in 2014. That's the one that we have all the evidence and evaluation and data about, but I will touch a little on the plans that we have for the next iteration, next version of this exercise, and happy to also answer questions on that in the discussion. And then in the third part, I want to run through quite quickly 10 lessons that we've taken about impact itself, about what are the characteristics of impact from research, and also about processes for assessing impact. So hopefully that will give some food for thought and food for discussion. So first, some context on the UK system. In many ways, similar to many countries have similar systems, but there are some unique features. The first point is that we have a dual funding approach, as I think you do here. So my organisation allocates block grant funding to universities for research. We have research councils focused on different disciplines that hand out project-based funding. So we have those two streams, and both of those streams are very strongly performance-based. So the research evaluation process that I'm going to talk about today for universities determines the allocation of around £2 billion of block grant funding annually. And the whole of that block grant funding is dependent in some way on quality evaluation, and a large proportion of it is dependent on the outcomes of the exercise that I'm going to talk about. That really is an important context for the UK. This exercise is a very important part of the funding landscape and occupies a lot of attention within UK universities. We also have a long history of allocating funding in that way, and a long history of national research assessment processes. So this is a kind of timeline of going back to the first national evaluation called the Research Selectivity Exercise that took place in 1986. Through a number of iterations, it became the RAE, or the Research Assessment Exercise, and there were 4 versions of that. And now we're into the phase of the Research Excellence Framework, which, as I say, took place first in 2014 and will take place again in 2021. Across the history of those exercises, there has been some continuity. So every one of those exercises has involved the evaluation of research outputs. By research outputs, we mean the things that you all produce in the course of your research: journal articles and books and data sets and websites and all the diverse array of things. And those are, in a sense, what you might call conventional ex post research evaluation objects. We're as has already been mentioned, we're very familiar with how we go about assessing those. Again, running through all of that history of assessment, we've had some assessment of the environment of research. This is more forward-looking, in a sense. What are the conditions within particular departments or institutions? And then we've had other elements that have come and gone. I won't dwell on the esteem element, which I think was a key part of the RAE, but now looking back historically seems a very odd way to go about things. It looked at things like prizes and journal editorships and so on, which are very easy to construct good stories around without really very much evidence. And then in the ref, we've moved to considering broader societal impact, and that will be the topic of most of my discussion today. The third thing to just say about the UK research system then is that we have had also, as well as a long history of national evaluation, we've actually had within our research policy landscape a focus on impact for quite a long time, even though we might not have called it impact, and that word is relatively new in the discourse. That there has been a focus on delivering benefits from research since at least the early 1990s, when there were major reforms and restructures of our research councils and changes to their missions to increase the focus on delivering benefit from research. So that is an important context and long-standing context. But the kind of the impact narrative itself has become more dominant in the last decade, with the so-called Pathways to Impact element of research grants being introduced in 2008. That requires researchers who are applying for funding to articulate how they will deliver benefits, so to plan for impact, if you like, in that section. And then finally, the final piece in the puzzle is the impact element that was added to the national evaluation system in 2014, or for the 2014 exercise. What we like to think of as a rounded policy environment where broader societal impact is treated as at least having high importance and having some parity with research quality, scientific excellence, academic quality. So, having given you that bit of background, then what is the research excellence framework? How does it work, and how do we assess impact within it? So, the research excellence framework is essentially a process to assess the quality of research in UK universities. It covers the whole of research, so every discipline is covered, and independent of how that research is funded. And it's carried out by, or was in 2014, carried out by 36 expert panels that had a disciplinary focus. And those 36 panels were grouped together into 4 main panels, so-called main panels, that had an oversight of those each individual, or those groups of disciplines. And the 4 main panels are listed on the slide. Main panel A covered medical and life sciences. Main panel B, physical sciences and engineering. Main panel C, the social sciences, and main panel D, the arts and humanities. The official names of those panels are A, B, C, and D, not the words that you see describing them. That's because when we try and name the panels, that creates a huge amount of debate about exactly which words you include and don't include. And so the simplest solution to that is simply to call them A, B, C, and D. But they do cover those areas. The process is one that takes place over a number of years. So this gives you the timeline for the 2014 process. The panels are selected and appointed relatively early in the process and develop criteria and guidance. Important thing to note about the panels, that they are made up of disciplinary experts, but drawn from both academia and from the worlds outside academia, what we term the users of research. So these might include people from business and industry who have an interest in research, people from government and policymakers, patient groups, clinicians, non-governmental organizations. Whole range of organizations are represented on those panels. And I think that's a really important feature of the system, that particularly around the evaluation of impact, that it's done not just by the academy, but also by those who are the users of research, the the agents of impact in broader society. Universities prepare submissions to the process, and then those submissions are assessed by the 36 expert panels, and conclusions are drawn, and effectively a profile is constructed. I don't have a slide on exactly how the exercise is scored. We can talk about that in the discussion if you wish. The exercise in 2014 was framed in this way. We had the three elements of the exercise: quality of research outputs, impact of research on society, and the research environment. And those were weighted in the ways that are indicated on the slide. So 65% on quality of research outputs, 20% on impact, 15% on research environment. And some numbers on this slide just to give you some idea of the scale of the exercise. That in the research outputs section, that just under 200,000 research outputs were assessed. The vast bulk of them, 150,000, were journal articles, and most of the rest were books, but there were a few other things. Those outputs came from around 50,000 staff. On the impact element, and I'll talk about this in more detail in a moment, we assessed case studies, and there were some 7,000 case studies assessed as part of this process. So it's a large-scale activity involving around 1,200 panel members. My team is relatively small, of 15 to 20 people. It varies during the exercise, but no small undertaking to carry this out. Just quickly to think about what is happening in the next exercise. I'm not going to talk much in detail, as I said, but just one thing to note is that what we have changed for the next exercise is we've increased the weighting on impact. So the weighting is now 60% on outputs, 25% on impact. And that, I think, is a kind of vote of confidence in the process that we feel it was successful last time, and as a result of that, we'll increase the emphasis in the future. As I say, happy to talk about the detail of the next exercise in the discussion. So just going to the impact element itself in a bit more detail. How do we define impact for this process? The definition is up there on the screen. We define impact as an effect on, change, or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy or services, health, the environment, or quality of life beyond academia. And those two words at the end are really quite important. This is about change and benefit outside of the academy. That definition of impact is intentionally very, very broad, and is meant to, in the context of our exercise, give all types of research in all disciplines an opportunity to demonstrate the effect on, change, or benefit that they bring, those research in those disciplines brings about. So an intentionally broad definition. Whether that definition is useful to you in the context of your strategic research programs, I think, is an interesting question for debate, but that's where we started from in terms of this exercise. In order to assess the exercise, we asked institutions to produce a 4-page narrative case study of some examples of impact. So they needed to write something special, which I think you're already in the process of doing. That case study needed to include not just information about impact itself, but also about the research that was related to that impact, the so-called underpinning research. We were keen to establish not necessarily direct causal links between research and impact, but at least to associate impact with the research that had been carried out. The case study also needed to include evidence and corroboration. So these are narratives, but they're not just stories, is the line that I like to say. They are based on evidence. That evidence needs to be included. And finally, just to re-emphasize a point I've already made, the assessment was carried out by both academics and research users. So it had a very diverse approach to that assessment, and I think that is a very important part of the process. So this is what a case study looks like. Obviously, you can't read this. It's 4 pages. It's structured in a particular way. There is is details of the impact, there is details of the underpinning research, there's space to include references to the literature and so on. And just to zoom in on this one, this is about systems of innovation. It is based on research that was published right at the beginning of the time window that we allowed in 1993. And I chose it because it's one of the 170 or so of the case studies that mention Finland in them. So you can see that Finland is down there at the end of the summary, and there is a claim that this research had some influence on innovation policy in Finland. So that's why I chose this particular case study out of 7,000. But if you're interested in these case studies, you can go and look at them all. We put them all up online on a searchable database. There are not quite all of the case studies. There are 6,637 case studies available on the database, covering all disciplines and almost all universities in the UK. They have all this underpinning research that's related to the impact. There's more than 36,000 pieces of underpinning research, but 36,000 of the pieces of underpinning research have DOIs attached to them, so that means you can do interesting things with them and interesting analysis. You can access this database to search it. You can download if you're interested in programmatically accessing it. There's an API and so on. And just to emphasize, the impact for the exercise needed to happen in a particular time window between 2008 and 2013. And the underpinning research also had a time window, but a very long one, 20-year time window. So we were interested in impacts that potentially had arisen from research as long ago, or research published as long ago as 1993. This database is a really interesting and useful research tool, as well as being an assessment tool. It does have some limitations. The case studies were produced for an assessment purpose, and there were some rules about what could and couldn't be included. So it's not a representative sample of UK university impact, but it is a very interesting sample, and there's lots of research, there's lots of analysis we've done, lots of research that we've commissioned and others have done using this data source, and it is a very interesting snapshot about how impact works. So hopefully I've given you a flavour of the introduction. I've got now in my time 10 minutes left to tell you 10 lessons, so I better go through them quite quickly. That's a minute per lesson. What have we learned from evaluating impact? Well, first thing to say is this is going to be pretty quick fire, but this is based on a large amount of evaluation evidence that we collected and commissioned at the end of the process. So there are 15 documents on this screen. There are actually more reports that I'm going to refer to in the course of this. So my 10 lessons are based on several hundred pages of detailed evaluation evidence. So I'm going to run through the evidence very quickly, but it is my message is these are robust lessons that we think are well supported by evidence. So my first lesson is that this process has provided strategic insight for universities. Universities have learned more about what they do and why it makes a difference in the world. I love this quote, which comes from one of our evaluation reports, which says that from a university who was interviewed as part of the evaluation and said the most positive aspect of preparing for REF 2014 was to illuminate the vast array of research impact which the university may not otherwise have realized it had. So this, I think this has affected, as you'll see in a moment, the way in which universities go about thinking about their research and the impact that comes from it. My second lesson is that using case studies in this way with a mixed evaluation panel has been an effective evaluation method. The evaluation report that we commissioned from RAND Europe concluded by a large majority panelists felt the process enabled them to assess impact in a fair, reliable, and robust way. That's the top-level general conclusion. I think Gemma's talk that's coming will delve into this issue in more detail, and I think has some really interesting insights and challenges to us. But overall, this was an effective way of assessing impact. My third lesson is that, sorry, but there's limited potential for using metrics to assess broader impact. So we took a narrative case study approach. One of the questions that we wanted to understand after that was, were the ways that we could have captured some of this using metrics. The conclusion from research done for us by King's College London and Digital Science was that the quantitative evidence supporting claims for impact was diverse and inconsistent, suggesting the development of robust impact metrics is unlikely. And we've delved into this in a lot more detail, and we are for the next exercise tackling this inconsistent point. So we're trying to make sure that where people do use quantitative evidence in their case studies, they do it in a consistent way. But the diversity is such that there is no list of metrics that will allow you to assess broader societal impact, would be my conclusion. Evidencing impact is my next lesson. Evidencing impact is difficult and was probably the biggest challenge that universities faced in the course of this exercise. So again, this is another quote from the RAND evaluation. Evidence was the most difficult element of creating the document, and as a result, you ended up thinking more about the evidence rather than the impact. The question was, can I evidence this? We're hopeful that that situation has improved for the next exercise. Impact was introduced in the 2014 exercise relatively late in the day, and universities were struggling, or did struggle, to capture some of this evidence, potentially going back 20 years of the impact that their research had had. Next time, we know that the preparations have been much more thorough, and we're also changing some of the processes around evidence to actually help that. But I don't think there are any shortcuts. Evidencing impact is hard and is new, and does require some effort. My next fifth lesson is that introducing an assessment process like this has changed behavior and incentives within the university system. This is something we set out to do. This was an aim of the introducing impact, to change the way in which research was thought about in universities. And again, this slide just summarized some of the evidence that we had already seen in 2015 of universities changing in response to this impact agenda. So most universities will now have some sort of strategy around delivering impact for their research. They now have permanent staff focused on delivering impact. They have systems to store and capture evidence. Going back to that evidence point, this is now being done much more systematically and on an ongoing basis. Impact planning, or planning for impact, is now a central part of all of the research work that universities do. It's front and center of their thinking. And we're starting to see inclusion of impact as a criteria for promotion or recruitment of academic staff. So as alongside criteria for research quality, teaching, and other activities, impact is becoming more important. So moving now more onto what we've learned about impact and less about the process of evaluating it. My next lesson is that impact is a really diverse phenomenon, that the types of change that result from research are very, very broad. So to give you an illustration of that, this is a visualization taken from some work that King's College London did for us, looking at the impact case studies using the approach of text mining and data analytics. So what they were able to do was to look at the text, millions of words that were submitted in those case studies, analyze it using a technique called topic modeling, and out of that we're able to identify 60 distinct areas of impact that were represented in the case studies. Those 60 areas are across the top of this slide, so you can, I'll zoom in and you can see the sorts of diversity within that. So, impact on Asia, mobile technologies, nuclear energy, architecture and building, and so on. And down the side of this slide are the 36 disciplinary panels, and what this infographic illustrates is the complex way in which that diverse array of impact maps onto 36 disciplinary groupings, with clearly some types of impact more focused in some disciplinary areas, but other types spread across all of the panels. And this, I could spend 30 minutes at least just talking about this one slide and the detail and the insight that comes from it, but it's really helping us understand what impact is and how it comes about. So my next lesson is about the importance of interdisciplinary research in delivering impact. So again, another infographic from the King's College London report. What this shows you is the relationship between the research disciplines down the left-hand side of the slide, the panel, the assessment panels, and the 60 types of impacts, which are down the right-hand side. And just to give you some idea, again, zooming in, the level of granularity, this came from, again, a text mining approach, looking at the underpinning research and how it was described and assigning it to disciplinary categories. They're actually, for the research evaluation geeks in the audience, they're the Australia-New Zealand research categories. What is striking from this is the diversity. There are something like 3,000 different paths between an academic discipline and a type of impact evidenced on this slide. 2/3 of the case studies drew on research from 2 or more disciplines. So the vast majority of the case studies were interdisciplinary in their nature, which I don't think is a surprise to anyone, but is now evidenced on the basis of this data set. My next lesson, apologies for slightly out of time, but I only have 3 more lessons left. My next lesson is on impact and academic quality. This is a question that comes up regularly. Is there any compromise between these 2 things? Well, we have a way of answering that question within this evaluation process, because we've measured independently in the same departments their research output quality and their impact quality. So how do those relate to one another? This is the whole data set on that. So each of these dots on here, there are 1,300 of them, is a discipline in a university. So it's a submission to the exercise. So it's across the entire spectrum of disciplines and all the universities, with the performance on research outputs on the horizontal axis and the performance on impact on the vertical axis, with evidence that there is a relationship between those 2 things, although it's not a sort of given, if you like. So there are examples of places that score very highly on impact and very low on output quality, and vice versa. But by and large, there is a tendency for the places that do the very best research to also be the places that generate the very highest impact. Again, you can start exploring this at a disciplinary level. There's a lot more detail in here, but the overall message, I think, is clear. My 9th lesson is that time lags are interesting and variable. So you can get a handle on time lags for impact from this data set, because you can look at the oldest piece of research in each of the case studies. And because you know the impact happened between 2008 and 2013, you can then say how old was the oldest piece of research. That's shown on this slide with interesting different patterns for the life sciences and physical sciences and engineering, where the research, the lags are really pretty evenly distributed across the 20-year window. So they're just a case study is just as likely to have research from 1993 as it is to have research from 2008. So the time lags can be long in those disciplines, but they can also be short. They're across a wide range. Different pattern in the social sciences and humanities, where there is a real recency skew. So the lags, at least for the case studies that were submitted, are much shorter in those discipline areas, with most of the research, underpinning research, much of the underpinning research being published relatively soon before the impact has arisen. Again, really interesting questions that this raises, and happy to discuss that in the discussion period. And finally, my last lesson, which is more for the academy, I guess, than for individual projects, but this data set, as I think I've already hinted, gives you strategic insight nationally into the way in which your research system is working and what it's delivering. And I'm just, 2 pieces of work which I'm just going to touch on. this, we're now able, using this data set in ways that I can again elaborate on, link case studies to research grants. So we're now starting to build a narrative, not just about where the underpinning research comes from that leads to impact, but how that research was funded and what the processes are that lead to impact. Starting to make some interesting insights about the types of funding that lead to impact and the diversity of the funding mix. So really interesting data set nationally from that point of view. And then just my final example is that we're also able to use this to look at the geographical reach of individual universities because we can mine the data to look at the locations where impact has taken place. So the data on the slide here is the reach of the University of Oxford, both nationally and internationally. And you can see that the research from that university is having impacts across the UK with a strong focus back into London. There is a strong local focus as well, a lot of impact in the Oxford area itself, but also globally with impacts from the University of Oxford being evidenced in a very large proportion of the countries of the world, as you can see from the world map. And again, this type of analysis is giving us real insight into the way different universities focus their activities and perform, and also influencing our approach to funding in some cases. So those are my 10 lessons. Sorry to have overrun a little bit, but I added 2 lessons late in the day, so we've gone from 8 to 10. I hope I've given you an introduction to the system and how the REF works, and at least some food for thought for your discussions later today. Thank you very much.